Imagine it's 1986. You're at a charity dinner in Manhattan's Upper East Side. The room costs $10,000 a table. The suits are pressed. The watches catch the candlelight. At one table, a real estate developer with gold cufflinks talks for 40 minutes about a deal he just closed in Atlantic City. He orders the most expensive wine on the menu twice and leaves his business cards everywhere, deliberately. At another table, a man in a modest gray suit sits quietly. He drinks water and listens more than he speaks. When he does speak, it is slow and deliberate, as if each word carries a weight he has already calculated. Within 10 years, the man with the gold cufflinks will have filed for bankruptcy twice and built a career around appearing wealthy. The man in the gray suit will have quietly compounded his holdings across 4 countries, structured his estate across 2 generations, and never once appeared in a financial magazine. His grandchildren will never have to work unless they choose to. This is not coincidence, it is a structural pattern. And once you understand it, you will never look at a display of wealth the same way again. Thing 1. They never tell you what they're worth. In 1889, Andrew Carnegie published one of the most read financial essays of the Gilded Age. He was specific about principles and precise about the responsibilities of wealth. But if you read that essay carefully, Carnegie never once told you his actual net worth. He described the obligation of wealth and the mechanism of wealth, but the number stayed private. This is not incidental. The moment someone tells you their net worth, they have revealed something more important than the number itself. They have revealed that they believe the number is an asset worth displaying. Real accumulated wealth is not simply a number. It is a structure. A set of positions, legal entities, income-generating relationships, businesses, property, and compounding instruments that cannot be accurately summarized by a single figure. When someone tells you they're worth $40 million, they are advertising a target. The Rothschild family operated for generations with deliberate opacity regarding their actual consolidated holdings. Historians have debated their peak wealth for decades, while the family showed little interest in correcting the record. Not necessarily because they were hiding something criminal, but because ambiguity itself can be protective. Now contrast that with the Vanderbilts. Cornelius Vanderbilt built one of the largest fortunes in American history. By his death in 1877, his estate was estimated at more than $100 million. His heirs displayed it lavishly, built enormous homes, threw parties, and turned wealth into a visible part of their identity. Then came one of the great historical ironies. When the Vanderbilt family held a reunion in 1973, not a single attending Vanderbilt descendant was a millionaire. The lesson is not that every person who hides their wealth will become rich, or that every person who displays wealth will become poor. The deeper lesson is that wealth preservation requires thinking about the structure rather than the signal. When someone with serious money refuses to tell you what they are worth, that silence can be a form of discipline. Thing 2, they never tell you what they're buying. In 2008, as the global financial system was revealing just how much risk had been mispriced, something interesting was happening inside a small number of private offices. Quietly, certain investors were buying distressed debt, foreclosed commercial property, and equity in companies that had disappeared from the headlines because their stories had become too painful to cover. They did not announce these purchases. They did not post about them. They simply bought. 5 years later, some of those positions had returned 3, 4, or 5 times their original value. There is a structural reason why sophisticated investors often avoid announcing their positions. Markets are pricing mechanisms, and they respond to information. The moment a large and credible investor publicly announces a position, the price of that asset can change. The announcement itself can become part of the trade. Warren Buffett is one of the most studied investors in modern history. Many of his most important positions were accumulated quietly over years before becoming publicly visible through required disclosures. By the time the public knew what he owned, he had often already captured a significant portion of the opportunity. That is not necessarily manipulation. It is simply an understanding of how markets respond to information. Now consider the person loudly telling you what they are buying. Sometimes they are sharing genuine information, but sometimes they need your participation. They need buyers. They need liquidity. You are the buyer. John Kenneth Galbraith documented similar behavioral patterns in his analysis of speculative bubbles and financial panics. The pattern appeared in 1929 during the dot-com collapse, again in 2008, and repeatedly throughout financial history. The people who built and preserved wealth across those periods often said very little about what they were doing. The people who lost money were frequently among the loudest advocates for the assets that eventually collapsed. The silence is not necessarily a personality trait. Sometimes the silence is the edge. Thing 3, they never brag about how they spend. In 1899, Thorstein Veblen introduced the concept of conspicuous consumption in the theory of the leisure class. His observation was simple but powerful. People sometimes purchase expensive goods not primarily because they need them, but because those goods communicate social status. Veblen was not simply making a moral argument, he was describing a social mechanism. One of the most interesting things about conspicuous consumption is that it is not necessarily concentrated among the wealthiest people. It is often strongest among people who have recently acquired money or people who want to be perceived as having money. Post-World War II, America provides a useful example. As the middle class expanded, an enormous consumer economy developed around the desire to look successful. Cars, houses, clothing, watches, appliances, and countless other products became potential status signals. The advertising industry understood that people could be convinced to spend money today in exchange for the feeling that other people would think they were wealthy. But every dollar spent on display is a dollar that cannot compound. The difference becomes enormous over decades. Thomas Stanley and William Danko documented this in The Millionaire Next Door. Their research challenged the popular image of the millionaire. Many millionaires did not live in extravagant homes or drive luxury vehicles. Their spending habits often looked surprisingly ordinary. The pattern makes mathematical sense. A dollar spent on a depreciating status symbol stops working for you, while a dollar invested can continue producing returns. The difference is not limited to the original dollar. It includes every future return that dollar could have generated. The person wearing the expensive watch may be signaling wealth. The person quietly investing the same money may actually be building it. The person with the gold cufflinks was paying for a costume. The person in the gray suit was buying time. Thing 4, they never perform their failures. Every documented story of major wealth accumulation contains failures. The Carnegie story, the Rockefeller story, and the early histories of major financial dynasties, all business disputes, market collapses, and periods of serious uncertainty. The path to structural wealth is rarely a perfectly upward line. But there is an important difference between learning from failure and performing failure. Modern financial media has created an entire genre around successful people, explaining how they failed. The failure becomes the story. The story creates credibility, the credibility builds an audience, and the audience can then be monetized through products, courses, books, consulting, or investment content. That does not automatically make the story dishonest, but it means the failure has become an economic asset. For someone with serious wealth, publicly discussing a failure can create very different risks. It can expose legal liabilities, reveal proprietary decisions, provide competitors with information, create narratives that future litigants may use, and consume time. There's another problem. Real failure is rarely as clean as the stories we hear about it. The public version usually has a beginning, a crisis, a lesson, and an uplifting resolution. Actual failure is often messy. There may be years of uncertainty. Bad decisions may remain unresolved, and some mistakes may never produce a neat lesson. When you hear someone narrating a business failure with perfect precision and a clear moral at the end, you may be hearing a carefully constructed story. Not necessarily a dishonest one, but a performance designed to create an outcome. People with serious structural wealth often have much less incentive to participate. Their failures do not need to become content. They can remain private files in a lawyer's office. Thing 5, they never reveal their tax architecture. In 1935, Franklin Roosevelt stood before Congress and discussed the transmission of vast fortunes from one generation to another. The central structural question was obvious. Could large fortunes be organized in ways that changed how they were taxed, transferred, and protected? The answer was yes, but doing it effectively requires sophisticated legal and financial architecture. The tax system is not simply a flat percentage applied to a person's income. It contains different structures for businesses, investments, estates, trusts, charitable vehicles, deferred compensation, capital gains, and other forms of wealth. That creates opportunities for people with enough resources to hire specialized professionals. ProPublica's 2021 investigation into IRS data demonstrated how some of America's wealthiest individuals had extremely low effective federal income tax rates in certain years. The critical point is that many of these mechanisms are legal. Trust structures can be legal, charitable vehicles can be legal, cost-basis strategies can be legal, entity structures can be legal, but the specific architecture is highly personal. Which structure, which jurisdiction, which assets, which sequence, which beneficiaries? That is where the real complexity begins. And that is exactly what wealthy families rarely discuss publicly. Once a specific strategy becomes widely known, it can attract regulatory attention. Legislators notice, tax authorities notice, lawyers notice. The strategy can eventually be modified or eliminated. Someone publicly explaining how they legally paid almost no taxes may therefore be doing something counterproductive. They are revealing information that may already be outdated by the time everyone hears it. The silence around sophisticated tax architecture is not necessarily mysterious. Sometimes it is simply maintenance of the advantage. Once everyone knows the edge, it stops being an edge. Think this: they never tell you where it actually came from. There is often a difference between the story wealthy families tell about themselves and the story historians find in the records. The Rockefeller fortune is a useful example. John D. Rockefeller was extraordinarily disciplined and operationally effective, but Standard Oil also benefited from secret railroad rebate arrangements that created structural advantages over competitors. Both facts can be true. The public story tends to emphasize discipline, vision, efficiency, and entrepreneurial genius. The more complicated structural advantages are often discovered through investigations, lawsuits, records, and historical research. This pattern extends beyond Rockefeller. Large fortunes frequently emerge from a combination of individual skill, access to capital, timing, inheritance, regulatory environments, political relationships, market conditions, information advantages, networks, and opportunities that may not have been available to everyone. None of these automatically makes a fortune illegitimate, but it does make the origin story more complicated. And complicated stories are harder to turn into simple myths. That is why origin stories are often curated. They are not necessarily complete lies, they are selective truths. The parts that make the person look disciplined are emphasized, while structural advantages are often pushed into the background. There is also a deeper reason. Wealth exists within a social contract. People are more comfortable with large fortunes when those fortunes appear to be the result of talent, discipline, and contribution. When structural advantage becomes the dominant explanation, that social acceptance can become weaker. So wealthy families often maintain carefully constructed narratives about where the money came from. The people who tell you every detail of exactly how they became rich may have nothing to protect, or they may have a product to sell. Sometimes both. Thing 7. They never brag about the network. In 1907, a banking panic threatened to collapse the American financial system. There was no Federal Reserve, no modern deposit insurance system, and no government mechanism capable of quickly injecting liquidity into the financial system. What ultimately helped stop the panic was a private meeting in J.P. Morgan's library. Morgan and a group of powerful bankers coordinated capital and acted together to stabilize the system. The important point is not whether they were heroes or villains. It is that the mechanism was private. The resource was the network. This pattern appears repeatedly at the highest levels of wealth. The most valuable relationships often do not appear on public profiles. Someone can have hundreds or thousands of professional connections and still lack the relationships that actually create access to major capital, opportunities, information, or deals. At the highest levels, relationships often develop years before a transaction becomes visible. The deal is not the beginning, the relationship is. This is why major transactions can sometimes appear to happen suddenly when they have actually been developing quietly for years. The network itself has value because of its trust and exclusivity. Once every relationship is publicly visible, that exclusivity decreases. People who constantly advertise how many connections they have may still be trying to enter rooms that other people have occupied for decades. The most important network may be the one nobody can see. Think 8. They never discuss their legal structures. During the early development of America's modern income tax and estate tax systems, wealthy families and their advisors began developing increasingly sophisticated structures for protecting and transferring assets. The mechanisms included trusts, family limited partnerships, dynasty trusts, charitable remainder trusts, and other legal vehicles. These are not secret. You can read about many of them in legal textbooks. The important part is the architecture. Which assets go where? Which entity owns what? Which jurisdiction applies? Who controls the entity? Who receives the benefit? How does everything interact? That configuration can be highly customized, and when a legal structure is working properly, there's often little reason to advertise it. Publicly revealing the structure can provide a roadmap to anyone who wants to challenge it. A tax authority can examine it. A divorcing spouse can investigate it. An heir can challenge it. A creditor can look for weaknesses. A legislature can change the rules. Legal architecture, therefore, depends not only on the existence of a legal instrument, but on how that instrument is constructed and maintained. People with serious legal structures discuss them with lawyers and accountants. They may discuss them with family members who need to know, but they rarely turn them into dinner party conversation or public social media content. An invisible fortress is harder to breach than a famous one. Thing 9. They never reveal how long it actually took. One of the biggest distortions in modern wealth content is the compression of time. We see the beginning, we see the outcome, we almost never see the boring decades between them. The years of incremental investing, saving, holding through recessions, and repeatedly saying no to unnecessary spending are almost invisible because they do not make exciting headlines. John D. Rockefeller began his career as an accounting clerk. He started his first business at 23. Standard Oil came later, and his greatest wealth accumulation happened over decades, not months. Charlie Munger provides another example. He was not a billionaire at 30, 40, or even 50. His enormous fortune emerged much later in life after decades of investing, learning, and compounding. The wealth did not arrive suddenly. The reporting did. That distinction matters. The public sees the outcome and assumes the process was equally fast. But compounding is almost invisible while it is happening. For years, nothing dramatic appears to change, and then the accumulated effect becomes enormous. This is one reason overnight success stories are so misleading. A 40-year timeline is not a marketing pitch. It is a commitment. And that is the gap between people who actually build wealth and people who perform wealth. Thing 10, they never perform their frugality. This may be the most counterintuitive silence. People who preserve wealth often spend less than they could, but they do not necessarily turn that behavior into a public identity. Frugality has become heavily monetized in modern personal finance. There are channels about budgeting, videos about saving, content about cheap meals, posts documenting every expense, and communities built around financial restraint. But once frugality becomes content, it becomes something different. It requires time, attention, and an audience. It can even become another form of performance. The person who quietly refuses to waste money is preserving capital. The person documenting that behavior may be building an audience. Both can be valuable, but they are different assets. One compounds financially, the other compounds through attention. The irony is that the people most qualified to explain how wealth is preserved may have very little incentive to explain every detail. Speaking publicly can expose strategies, consume time, attract competition, create regulatory attention, and turn private decisions into public obligations. Meanwhile, people with less to protect can fill the information gap with courses, strategies, blueprints, and simplified formulas. The silence is therefore not necessarily mysterious. It can be the rational outcome of having something valuable to protect. Every generation produces a new version of the same story. A group of people acquires money quickly, displays it loudly, and becomes the cultural image of wealth. Then, over a predictable period, much of that wealth disappears. Another group moves through the same period quietly. They preserve capital, avoid unnecessary attention, maintain relationships privately, and think in decades rather than moments. 20 or 30 years later, their structure is still intact. The pattern is not necessarily about intelligence, it is not about morality, and it is not even primarily about personality. It is about correctly identifying what the system rewards and what it punishes. Across the history of wealth preservation, one principle repeatedly appears: display attracts attention, silence protects structure. The question is not whether this pattern will continue. It is whether you recognize it when you see it. Because the next time someone walks into a room wearing every visible symbol of success, telling everyone exactly how much they earn, what they own, what they are buying, and how quickly they became rich, you should not automatically assume you are looking at wealth. You may simply be looking at the advertisement for wealth, and the person who actually has it may be sitting quietly somewhere else, listening, waiting, compounding, and saying almost nothing.